Brian Henry stood at the polished counter of the Henry Plaza Hotel's bar, methodically wiping it down. The final guests of the evening had drifted out, leaving the once bustling lobby eerily quiet. The stillness amplified every sound, the faint hum of machinery, the occasional murmur of a distant conversation. It was a silence that weighed heavily, pressing against the walls and sinking into the air. Brian's thoughts churned with the events of the past few days. The deeper he delved into the inner workings of Henry Plaza, the clearer it became. The hotel wasn't just struggling, it was teetering on the brink of collapse. Matteo's stranglehold on the business had created an environment so toxic it was suffocating the very foundation his father had built. But knowing wasn't enough. Brian needed solid evidence, something indisputable to expose Matteo's misdeeds. He also needed to unravel the web of complicity between Matteo and Judy. What secrets were they protecting? As Brian finished cleaning, his attention was drawn to the lobby. Matteo strode in, his movements sharp and purposeful, with Judy close beside him. Their heads were bent together in an intense discussion, their expressions shadowed with scheming intent. Brian kept his motions deliberate, ensuring he appeared absorbed in his tasks while straining to catch fragments of their conversation. "I don't care what the staff thinks," Matteo muttered, his tone laced with contempt. "Those budget cuts are happening. End of discussion. The board won't care, as long as the numbers look good." Judy nodded, though her glance darted nervously around the lobby. "But what about the complaints? The staff's morale is shot, and the guests are noticing. Service complaints have spiked this month." Matteo smirked, his confidence palpable. "Let them complain. As long as we're showing profits, the board won't blink. We'll keep this going until the quarter ends. After that, none of this will matter." Brian's chest tightened as the gravity of their words sank in. This wasn't mere negligence. It was calculated exploitation. Matteo and Judy were sacrificing service quality, the employees' well-being, and the hotel's reputation, all to line their pockets and appease the board with short-term results. They had fortified their positions, hiding the truth behind a wall of secrecy and manipulation. As the pair disappeared into the elevator, Brian clenched his fists. Their confidence was misplaced, and he was determined to prove it. But he couldn't act rashly. Matteo was already suspicious of him, and any misstep could jeopardize his mission before he was ready to strike. The next morning, Brian arrived early, intent on observing the hotel's behind-the-scenes operations more closely. His conversation with Grace had revealed much, but gaps remained. He needed a clearer picture of how the staff endured Matteo's regime and how they managed to keep the hotel afloat under such oppressive conditions. He decided to begin in the cafeteria, a hub where weary employees often let their guards down. Stepping into the dimly lit break room, Brian immediately noticed the oppressive atmosphere. The tension in the air felt almost tangible. Conversations were muted, and the occasional chuckle carried an edge of bitterness. He grabbed a cup of coffee and seated himself at a table near a group of housekeepers, careful to blend in while listening. "I heard Matteo's planning more layoffs," one woman said, her voice shaking. "They're going to cut the night shift and pile the extra work on us." A second housekeeper, visibly worn down, shook her head in disbelief. "That's impossible. We're already drowning as it is. If they cut more staff, everything will fall apart." Brian's jaw tightened. Matteo wasn't just driving his employees to exhaustion. He was preparing to dismantle the workforce entirely. The hotel, already held together by frayed seams, would unravel completely under the weight of such recklessness. "Why don't we report him?" a younger woman asked timidly. "Surely someone higher up would listen." The older housekeeper gave a bitter laugh. "To who? Judy's running HR, and Matteo's got the board wrapped around his finger. We're trapped." Brian's stomach churned. The situation was worse than he had anticipated. Matteo wasn't merely mishandling the hotel, he had constructed a system that stifled dissent and exploited the staff's vulnerability. By manipulating the board and using Judy as his enforcer, he had ensured his grip on Henry Plaza remained unshaken. The weight of their despair hung heavy in the room, and Brian knew he couldn't afford to hesitate. Mateo's schemes were a cancer, eating away at everything his father had built. But dismantling such deeply entrenched corruption required patience and strategy. He couldn't confront Mateo directly, not yet. His plan needed precision. Leaving the cafeteria, Brian's resolve solidified. This wasn't just about the hotel's survival. It was about protecting the people who had been silenced and beaten down. Mateo and Judy's empire of fear would crumble, and Brian would ensure that when it did, the staff would finally have the voice and the justice they deserved. Later that day, Brian Henry found himself back behind the counter of the lobby bar at Henry Plaza Hotel, pouring drinks for a group of business travelers. The bar was a hub of quiet chatter and clinking glasses, but Brian's attention was elsewhere. His sharp gaze followed the flow of activity in the lobby, observing how the staff interacted with guests. His intent wasn't casual curiosity. He was searching for cracks, moments where the strain of Mateo's leadership showed through. One moment in particular grabbed his focus. Linda, a receptionist with years of experience, was locked in a tense exchange with a disgruntled guest. The man's loud, agitated voice echoed through the elegant space, drawing the attention of other patrons. From behind the bar, Brian could see Linda's professional demeanor holding steady, though the stress etched in her expression betrayed her struggle to keep things under control. "I've been waiting over an hour," the guest barked, slamming his hand on the counter for emphasis. His face was flushed with frustration. "This is ridiculous. I demand to speak to a manager right now." Linda's voice remained calm, her tone carefully measured as she apologized and reassured him that the situation was being resolved. But her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the phone, preparing to call for backup. Before she could make the call, Mateo strode into the scene, his movements quick and calculated. "What seems to be the issue here?" Mateo's voice carried a practiced charm, smooth yet tinged with impatience. He exuded the air of someone who believed himself firmly in control. The guest turned his frustration on Mateo, venting his anger. "The issue is your staff's incompetence. My room wasn't ready when I arrived, and I've been kept waiting like a fool. This is supposed to be a 5-star hotel." Mateo didn't spare Linda so much as a glance as he addressed the guest. "I sincerely apologize for the delay," he said, his tone oozing with faux sincerity. "I'll personally ensure your room is ready within minutes." Turning to Linda, his expression hardened into an unyielding glare. "Upgrade this guest to a suite immediately. Move quickly." Linda's hesitation was brief but noticeable. Her face drained of color as she nodded and hurried away to fulfill Mateo's order. Brian's jaw clenched as he watched the scene unfold. Mateo turned his full attention back to the guest, turning on his well-rehearsed charm. Within moments, the guest's anger was pacified, his ego soothed by Mateo's promises and apparent attentiveness. But Brian saw through the performance. Mateo's actions weren't about genuinely addressing the problem or caring for the guest's experience. It was about maintaining a facade of control and authority. Once the guest was satisfied and walked away, Mateo's demeanor shifted entirely. He turned on Linda, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper that Brian could still overhear. "Don't ever make me look bad in front of a guest again," Mateo hissed. "Do your job properly, or I'll find someone who can." Linda's face tightened, though she said nothing. She simply nodded, retreating to the back office with hurried steps. Brian's hands gripped the edge of the bar as a wave of anger surged through him. Mateo's leadership wasn't just flawed, it was toxic. He was eroding the morale and dignity of the staff under the guise of maintaining order. Brian knew this incident was just another example of the dangerous pattern he'd been observing. Mateo was balancing on a precarious tightrope, keeping up appearances for guests while pushing his employees closer to their breaking points. It was a volatile mix, and Brian couldn't shake the feeling that the entire operation was teetering on the brink of collapse. Taking a steadying breath, Brian resolved to keep watching, listening, and learning. Mateo's reign wouldn't last forever. Change was coming, and Brian would make sure of it. For now, though, he had to stay quiet, play his part, and wait for the right moment to expose the truth. At the end of his shift, Brian Henry found himself in the dimly lit staff break room where Grace sat slumped in a chair. She looked utterly drained, her posture sagging with the weight of yet another grueling day. Her usual spark of determination was dimmed, replaced by visible fatigue. "Mateo tore into Linda today," Brian said, his tone hushed yet tinged with frustration. "He's going to keep pushing people until something gives." Grace nodded, pressing her fingers to her temples. "It's inevitable. People are already talking about leaving, but no one can afford to. They're trapped." Brian paused, carefully considering his words before speaking. What if there was a way to stop him? To expose what he's doing and hold him accountable? Grace's gaze lifted slowly to meet his, her expression skeptical. "What are you saying?" "And I'm saying if someone could gather real proof, evidence of what's happening behind closed doors, maybe the board would listen. Maybe we could get Mateo out of here." Her eyes widened in alarm. "You can't be serious. No one's ever managed to get that kind of evidence. Mateo's too cautious. And even if someone did, Judy would make sure it disappeared." Brian leaned in, his voice steady but firm. What if I told you I'm already working on it?" Grace's expression froze, her worry plain. "Are you out of your mind? If Mateo finds out—" "It won't," Brian interrupted, his voice resolute. "But I can't do this alone. I need your help. You know this hotel better than anyone. You see what goes on behind the scenes." Grace bit her lip, the conflict in her eyes evident. "Brian, this sounds dangerous. If something goes wrong, it's the only way things will ever change," he said, leaning forward. His voice softened, but his words carried a quiet determination. "You said it yourself. This can't go on. Something has to give." For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy with unspoken fears and possibilities. Grace studied him, her expression shifting as resolve began to replace doubt. Finally, she exhaled deeply, her shoulders straightening. "All right," she said, her voice steady but cautious. "I'll help you, but you need to promise me something." "What's that?" Brian asked. "That you'll be careful," she said, meeting his eyes with an intensity that left no room for argument. "If Mateo even suspects what you're doing, it could be worse than you think." Brian nodded, a small smile of gratitude touching his lips. "I promise." In that moment, an unspoken alliance formed between them. It wasn't just about bringing down Mateo or Judy, it was about restoring the Henry Plaza Hotel to what it had once been. They both knew the road ahead would be dangerous, but for the first time in weeks, Brian felt a glimmer of hope. If Mateo discovered their plan, it would be over for both of them. Brian Henry managed a grim smile. "Don't worry," he said with quiet determination. "I've got this figured out." Deep down, Brian knew the coming days would test him in ways he hadn't anticipated. After enlisting Grace's help to gather the necessary evidence, the responsibility weighed heavily on him. The employees at Henry Plaza were depending on him, whether they realized it or not. As Brian continued his undercover role as Brian Matthews, he couldn't afford even the slightest misstep. Mateo's suspicions were already brewing, and one wrong move could undo everything. Another long shift loomed ahead, and as Brian entered through the staff entrance, the dim hallway leading to the break room felt like walking a tightrope over a stormy sea. The atmosphere inside the hotel had worsened noticeably since Brian's arrival. Employees moved with precision, their actions efficient but devoid of energy. Beneath their polished exteriors, there was a palpable sense of dread. Entering the locker room to change into his uniform, Brian spotted Scott, the bartender, leaning heavily against one of the lockers. Scott's head rested in his hands, his face drawn with exhaustion. "Rough night?" Brian asked, casually breaking the silence as he adjusted his uniform. Scott lifted his gaze, his eyes tired and glassy. "Try rough week," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "Between Mateo breathing down our necks and guests getting more entitled by the day, it's a wonder anyone here can still function." Brian nodded in agreement. He had witnessed the punishing work environment himself. Unrelenting shifts, impossible expectations, and a complete lack of recognition. He watched as Scott fumbled with a bottle of painkillers, shaking out 2 tablets and swallowing them with a gulp of water. His hands trembled slightly, a detail that didn't escape Brian's notice. "You think things are going to spiral even further?" Brian asked, his tone casual yet inquisitive. Scott scoffed bitterly, shaking his head. "Spiral? Matthews, you're new, but you've seen enough by now. Mateo doesn't care about us, just numbers. Every time you think it can't get worse, he finds a way to prove you wrong." Scott's words settled over Brian like a heavy blanket. He mentally cataloged them, adding them to the growing narrative of Mateo's oppressive regime. Every conversation, every exhausted sigh from the staff, every bitter laugh, it all painted the same picture. Mateo wasn't just mismanaging Henry Plaza. He was systematically draining it of its soul, leaving the staff overworked, undervalued, and teetering on the edge. As Brian tied his apron and prepared to step out into the lobby, he resolved to keep gathering these small, crucial moments. Each one strengthened his case. Grace's partnership was just the beginning. Together, they'd find a way to expose Mateo and restore the Henry Plaza Hotel to what it was meant to be. But as Brian moved toward the bustling bar, the weight of what lay ahead pressed harder on his shoulders. Mateo wasn't just an obstacle, he was a dangerous adversary, and Brian couldn't afford to underestimate him. Later that day, Brian Henry found Grace seated in the staff cafeteria. They had planned to meet during their break to discuss the next steps in their risky plan. Grace appeared more uneasy than usual, her gaze flitting around the room as though she feared someone might overhear their conversation. "Did something happen?" Brian asked softly, taking the seat across from her. Grace let out a heavy sigh, running her fingers through her hair. "Mateo's getting paranoid," she murmured. "I overheard him talking to Judy earlier this morning. He's convinced someone's keeping tabs on him. He's been watching the staff more closely, trying to sniff out anything unusual." Brian felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Mateo's growing suspicion meant they had to tread even more carefully. One wrong move could unravel everything before they gathered the evidence they desperately needed. "What's the plan now?" Grace asked, her voice carrying a note of unease. Brian leaned in, lowering his voice further. "We stick to the plan, but with more caution. I've been thinking about how to get into Mateo's files. There's got to be something in his records. Something that shows how he's been manipulating the budget and implementing those staff changes." Grace's eyes widened in alarm. "You can't be serious," she whispered. "His office is off limits. You can't just walk in there without raising suspicion." Brian offered a faint smile, one that didn't quite hide the tension brewing within him. "Not if we time it right. Mateo has a lunch meeting every Thursday. He's gone for at least 2 hours. If we can get into his office during that time, we might find exactly what we need." Brie looked torn, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her coffee cup. "That's a huge risk, Brian. If you're caught—" "I won't get caught," Brian interrupted, his voice steady, though the weight of the risk hung heavily on his mind. "But I need you to keep watch. Make sure no one tries to go in while I'm there." Grace's expression remained conflicted, her teeth tugging at her bottom lip as she mulled over the idea. Finally, she gave a reluctant nod. "All right, I'll do it, but you need to be fast, Brian. This isn't something we can afford to mess up." Brian gave her a reassuring smile, even as his mind raced to map out the details. This plan was their best shot at exposing Matteo's corruption, and he knew they couldn't let fear hold them back. The following day arrived in a blur of anticipation. By Thursday afternoon, Brian Henry felt the familiar pulse of adrenaline coursing through him. Their plan hinged on precision, and Rodriguez's office was central to it all. If they could uncover damning financial records or incriminating correspondence, they would have the ammunition needed to take Matteo down. Brian loitered in the staff locker room, feigning busy work while covertly keeping an eye on the clock. Though his shift officially began later, he had orchestrated his schedule to be present for this critical moment. At exactly 1 p.m., Matteo strode confidently through the lobby, his demeanor as commanding as ever, before heading toward the main doors. Relief washed over Brian. Matteo was sticking to his usual routine, leaving them the opportunity they needed. Grace waited nervously in the hallway near the office, glancing anxiously down the corridor. When Brian arrived, she gave a terse nod, her expression tight with worry. "Matteo just left," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You've got 2 hours, maybe less. Stay sharp." Brian returned her nod, his heartbeat thundering in his chest as he slipped into the office. The room was a study in calculated elegance, with its leather chairs, dark wood furnishings, and an air of meticulous order. A commanding desk dominated the space, its surface adorned with neatly arranged files, a laptop, and a sleek black phone. He wasted no time. Brian headed straight for the laptop, knowing every second counted. The risk of interruption was ever present, and the margin for error was razor thin. The laptop, unsurprisingly, was password protected. But Brian had planned for this moment. Weeks earlier, during a fleeting but intentional glance, he had caught Matteo typing in his password. His sharp memory had preserved the sequence, even as Matteo remained unaware of the scrutiny. Holding his breath, Brian entered the password. A soft chime confirmed success, and the screen unlocked. Relief mingled with the urgency propelling him forward. Navigating quickly, Brian began combing through the maze of folders, searching for anything that would reveal Matteo's schemes. Financial discrepancies, incriminating emails, or records of misconduct. The files were meticulously organized, and Matteo's caution was evident. Many were encrypted, designed to hide their contents from prying eyes. Undeterred, Brian pressed on. Then, tucked away in a folder labeled innocuously under Operations, something stood out. Financial records revealed a troubling pattern. Funds earmarked for maintenance and renovations had been quietly diverted to unexplained accounts, their purpose and destination conspicuously absent. Brian's pulse quickened as he worked. This was it, the evidence he needed. His fingers flew across the keyboard, transferring the files to the USB drive he had brought for this exact purpose. If he could trace these transactions back to Matteo, it would provide the irrefutable proof the board needed. Just as he finished copying the files, faint footsteps echoed from the hallway. Panic surged through him. Someone was approaching. Brian hurriedly closed the laptop and slid the USB drive into his pocket. The handle of the office door began to turn. He froze, his heart pounding as he pressed himself into the shadows of the room, silently praying he wouldn't be discovered. Judy stepped into the room, her gaze sharp and unyielding as it locked onto Brian Henry. "What are you doing in here?" she demanded, her voice cold and edged with suspicion. Brian froze, his mind scrambling for a believable excuse. This wasn't the moment to falter, not when he was holding the key to dismantling Matteo's empire in his pocket. He lifted the rag he had brought, a hasty part of his cover. "Just cleaning," he said evenly. "Matteo asked me to tidy his office while he was out." Judy's eyes narrowed further, her skepticism palpable. "Matteo doesn't let anyone in here, least of all a waiter." A cold bead of sweat trickled down Brian's back. He needed to make his exit before her doubt turned into action. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, keeping his tone apologetic but firm. "I didn't mean to overstep." I'll leave." Before Judy could respond, Brian slipped past her, his steps quick and deliberate. His heart pounded as he walked down the hallway, resisting the urge to look back. Only when he reached the sanctuary of the staff locker room did he allow himself to exhale. That encounter had been far too close for comfort. Yet, despite the brush with disaster, the USB drive in his pocket reassured him. He had the evidence. Now it was time to figure out how to wield it. The tension from his confrontation with Judy lingered as Brian prepared for his next shift. The small drive in his pocket weighed heavily, a constant reminder of the precarious position he was in. He now held undeniable proof of Mateo's corruption. The financial records painted a clear picture. Money intended for Henry Plaza's upkeep and renovations had been siphoned off into shadowy accounts. Mateo wasn't just running the hotel into the ground, he was profiting from its decline. But the path ahead wasn't straightforward. Brian needed to act without tipping off Mateo or Judy, both of whom were growing increasingly wary. As he moved through the bustling lobby, Brian kept his head low, striving to blend in, yet he couldn't shake the memory of Judy's icy stare. She had looked at him as if she knew something was amiss. Later that evening, Brian retreated to a quiet corner of the staff cafeteria. Pulling his phone from his pocket, he began scrolling through the documents he had copied onto it. Each new transaction deepened his fury. Funds intended for vital repairs and updates had been funneled into personal accounts with no traceable connection to the hotel. Mateo had been stealing in plain sight, while the hotel staff bore the brunt of the consequences. The weight of it all pressed heavily on Brian. The employees of Henry Plaza were overworked, underpaid, and struggling to hold things together, while Mateo padded his pockets. It wasn't just about money, it was about the lives being disrupted, the trust being shattered. "Why?" The sound of Grace's voice pulled him from his thoughts. He glanced up to find her standing across from him, her expression taut with urgency. Her eyes darted around the room, ensuring no one was paying attention, before she slid into the seat opposite him. "Did you find anything?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Brian nodded, pulling the phone closer to show her the screen. "I've got it all. Financial records, suspicious transactions, everything. Mateo's been siphoning money meant for the hotel into his own accounts for months, maybe longer." Grace's eyes widened as she absorbed the gravity of what she was seeing. This is enough to bring him down," she murmured, her voice tinged with awe and disbelief. Brian met her gaze, his determination hardening. "It's a start, but we need to figure out how to use it without tipping him off. If Mateo finds out, he'll try to bury this, and us, with it." Grace nodded, her jaw set with resolve. "Then we have to be careful. But this is it, Brian. This is the proof we've been waiting for." Brian Henry nodded, a conflicted mixture of relief and apprehension coursing through him. They had the evidence, but the hardest part still lay ahead, deciding the safest way to use it. "We need to tread carefully," Brian said in a measured tone. "Going to HR isn't an option. Judy has that department under her control, and Mateo will shut everything down before anyone even gets a chance to see it." Grace pressed her lips together, her expression pensive. "What about the board? Could we bypass Mateo and take this straight to them?" Brian paused, weighing her suggestion. The board represented a glimmer of hope, but the risk was undeniable. If Mateo discovered their plan before they could present the evidence, he'd erase every trace of wrongdoing. "It's possible," Brian admitted cautiously, "but we can't be reckless. If Mateo catches wind of this, he'll bury the proof, and us, along with it." Grace nodded, her face reflecting the gravity of the situation. "So, what's the next move?" Brian stared down at his phone, the damning files staring back at him like a ticking clock. The pressure to act was immense, but the margin for error was razor thin. Rodriguez's paranoia was growing, and Judy's suspicions were already too close for comfort. "We'll have to bypass the usual channels entirely," Brian said, his voice firm. We need to get this into the hands of someone on the board who isn't under Mateo's thumb." Grace frowned, her brows furrowing. "Do you know anyone we can trust? Someone who'll actually listen?" Brian hesitated, his mind racing through possibilities. Then it hit him, a faint but meaningful thread of hope. Marvin, one of the senior board members, had been a close ally of Brian's father during the Henry Plaza Hotel's early days. Although Marvin had taken a step back from the hotel's daily operations in recent years, his reputation for integrity and his loyalty to Brian's father lingered. "I might know someone," Brian said slowly, his voice tinged with cautious optimism. "Marvin used to work closely with my father. He's someone I think I can trust. But it's a long shot. I'll need to approach him carefully, without raising any alarms." Grace studied his face, her eyes full of determination. "If he's our best chance, then it's worth the risk. Just tell me how I can help." Brian offered her a faint smile, appreciating her unwavering support. The road ahead was fraught with danger, but knowing Grace was by his side made the daunting task feel just a little more manageable. "First, we plan," he said resolutely, "and then we make our move, one step at a time." The following day, Brian Henry moved through his shift at Henry Plaza with mechanical precision, serving drinks, clearing tables, and exchanging polite smiles with guests all felt like motions without meaning. His thoughts, however, were consumed by the damning files now stored on his phone. Each passing hour heightened his sense of urgency. The longer they sat on the evidence, the greater the risk that Mateo might suspect something. By the time Brian's shift ended, he had reached a decision. It was time to act. An unexpected opportunity presented itself just a few days later. While passing through the lobby, Brian overheard a pair of guests chatting about an upcoming board meeting scheduled at the hotel for the weekend. His pulse quickened as he processed their words. Marvin Carter, the one person he could trust to handle the evidence, would undoubtedly attend. The timing felt almost too perfect, as if fate itself had aligned the stars for him. This was his chance to bypass the usual channels and reveal the truth directly to someone who could make a difference. Yet the plan carried enormous risks. Mateo would surely be at the meeting, his sharp gaze ever on the lookout for dissent. Any misstep, any hint that Brian was working against him, could unravel everything. Over the next few days, Brian meticulously crafted his strategy. He rehearsed the encounter in his mind, mapping out every word and move. There would be no room for error. The morning of the board meeting dawned, and the hotel hummed with anticipation. The lobby was alive with activity, a sea of executives and board members, each exuding an aura of power and importance. Brian moved carefully, blending into the background as he attended to his duties. He spotted Marvin Carter near the front desk, engaged in conversation with a small group of board members. Seeing him in person, a man once close to Brian's father, flooded him with a mixture of hope and anxiety. Just as Brian considered his approach, Mateo strode into the lobby. His commanding presence turned heads, his confidence practically radiating from every step. Brian's stomach churned as Mateo's eyes scanned the room with calculated precision. For a fleeting moment, their gazes met. Mateo's sharp features darkened slightly, his expression tinged with suspicion. Brian immediately looked away, forcing himself to focus on wiping down a table nearby. His hands trembled slightly as he worked, doing his best to appear unfazed. The moment felt endless, but eventually Mateo moved on, his attention drawn elsewhere. As the meeting time approached, the board members began filing into the designated room. Brian's heart hammered as he watched Marvin disappear inside with the others. The opportunity was within reach, but now came the most delicate part of his plan, finding Marvin alone once the meeting ended. The weight of what he was about to do settled heavily on his shoulders. How could he ensure the conversation would remain private? What if Marvin didn't believe him, or worse, dismissed his concerns entirely? Brian took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had come too far to let fear dictate his actions now. This was about more than just saving Henry Plaza. It was about preserving his father's legacy and standing up for the people who had been silenced for too long. The door to the boardroom had barely clicked shut when Brian Henry felt a light tap on his shoulder. Turning, he found Grace standing there, her expression taut with urgency. "Brian, we've got a serious problem," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the hum of activity in the lobby. "Judy's been asking around about you. She's convinced you're hiding something." Brian's heart sank. This was the scenario he had dreaded since the moment he'd gone undercover. Judy's growing suspicions meant the walls were closing in faster than he had anticipated. "She's been watching you," Grace continued, her eyes scanning the room nervously. "If she figures out what we're doing before you get that evidence to Marvin," her voice trailed off, but the unspoken consequences were clear. Brian clenched his jaw, his thoughts racing. Time was running out, and any hesitation could cost them everything. "I'll find a way to get Marvin alone after the meeting," he said decisively, his tone firm despite the pounding in his chest. "Once I hand over the evidence, Mateo's reign ends." Grace's gaze softened with worry, but there was a flicker of determination behind it. "Just be careful, Brian. If anything goes wrong—" "It won't," Brian interrupted, his voice steely. "It can't." Hours later, the board meeting adjourned, and Brian positioned himself discreetly near the exit. His heart thudded in his chest as the board members filed out, chatting amongst themselves. Near the back of the group, Marvin Carter emerged, deep in conversation with another executive. Brian steadied his nerves and stepped forward. "Mr. Carter," he said quietly, careful to keep his voice calm and measured. "Could I have a moment of your time? It's urgent." Marvin stopped, his eyebrows lifting slightly as he regarded Brian with mild curiosity. "Of course," he replied, motioning for his colleague to continue ahead without him. "What's this about?" Brian glanced over his shoulder, ensuring Mateo or Judy wasn't nearby. Lowering his voice, he leaned in. "It's about Mateo. He's been stealing from the hotel, and I have proof." Marvin's expression shifted instantly, his casual demeanor replaced by sharp focus. "Stealing? What kind of proof?" Without hesitation, Brian pulled out his phone, navigating to the files he'd painstakingly collected. Handing the device to Marvin, he explained the details. Misappropriated funds, falsified records, and missing money. As Marvin scrolled through the evidence, his face hardened, each new discovery deepening his scowl. "This is unbelievable," Marvin muttered, his tone tinged with both anger and disbelief. "How long's this been going on?" "At least 4 months," Brian replied. "Maybe longer. We need to act quickly. If Mateo suspects anything, he'll bury the evidence." Marvin's eyes narrowed as he handed the phone back to Brian. "Don't worry. I'll take care of this. Mateo won't get away with it." Relief washed over Brian like a wave. The evidence was finally in the right hands. Mateo's days of unchecked power at Henry Plaza were numbered. The following morning, a palpable tension hung over Henry Plaza. The usual rhythms of the hotel were disrupted, and the staff moved as if walking on eggshells. Brian could feel the weight of anticipation in the air. Something was brewing, and everyone could sense it. As he stepped behind the bar to start his shift, Brian noticed Scott already at work. The bartender's expression was grim, his movements hurried and sharp. Brian joined him silently, falling into the familiar routine of preparing drinks and arranging supplies. Yet his thoughts were consumed by Marvin's promise. Would Marvin confront Mateo today? Tomorrow? How would Mateo react when he realized his schemes had been uncovered? The questions swirled in Brian's mind, each more troubling than the last.